Welcome to this Festival Interrupted 2020 interactive session. This is a cross-arts virtual festival organised by the School of Performing and Digital Arts at Royal Holloway, University of London, and we are thrilled to see you all join us this afternoon. And there is a lovely gaggle of people, both Hollowegians, current, present and alumni, which is fantastic, and some special guests. My name is Nathan James Dearden, and I am the Performance Manager at the Department of Music of Royal Holloway, and have the absolute pleasure as Festival co-manager to welcome our esteemed panel of contributors for this roundtable session. We have our very own Director of Orchestras, Rebecca Miller, who will be chairing this session, a bundle of our current orchestral scholars at Royal Holloway. And our special guest is Thomas Hancox, a close friend of our orchestras here at Royal Holloway, who is currently both principal flute of Northern Ballet and co-principal of Britain's Sinfonia. So thank you all for joining us as well. Before I introduce our host to begin the roundtable discussion, just a few ground rules for the session. The chair will soon open this roundtable discussion with our orchestral scholars and special guest. Before then, we will open up the floor for questions and responses towards the end of the session. Please ensure your mics are muted for this section of the session, apart from, of course, our roundtable guests and contributors, so we can hear your beautiful voices. And this is to ensure that there's no residual background noise interrupting the host or anybody who is speaking at the time. Feel free to use the chat function, which is just below. I'm sure we're all familiar with that now on Zoom and MS Teams. Please feel free to utilize that. Send any questions that may spring to mind as the session develops, and our host will be able to bring you to the floor, as it were, during our discussion session. And our panel may also encourage you to join the conversation throughout the presentation. I'll be on hand to unmute you if you're feeling like you can't unmute yourself or you're struggling. I'll be here to help out. This interactive event is also being recorded for the Festival Interrupted website for you and others to be able to view and engage with the session at a later time. So this is now being recorded so we can take it out live on our website. So please join me with our virtual hand clapping emojis in welcoming our chair for the session and to open today's roundtable session, Rebecca Miller.
Great. Oh, it's lovely to see that. It's lovely to see you all. And thank you, Nathan, for not only hosting this session, but the many other sessions that you are hosting during this festival, for putting the festival together in such an amazing and creative way. And if you haven't seen some of the other sessions in Festival Interrupted, please do visit the website. There's a vast array of events and content there that's really fascinating, and not just in music, but in throughout the School of Performing and Digital Arts. And my thanks and compliments to the chef of the festival, Nathan, who has embraced this new COVID world with open arms and lots of creativity, and I have much admiration. It's wonderful to see you all here. I hope you all brought a round table with you. Is everybody sitting at a round table? No, we don't quite have a round table. I've got a square one in front of me. I don't know about you, but the title of the session is "What is an Orchestral Musician?" I hope we'll come to an answer by the end of the session, and maybe we'll come up with more questions than answers. But it was meant to be a discussion about what aspects of orchestras that I gave a session last week on the importance of orchestras in our community and the aspects of orchestras which I feel relate to our ability to function as a community, which, if you haven't seen the session, it was quite an interesting discussion and presentation. And I thought we'd talk today about what does that mean within the university context? What does it mean to current students? What does being involved in an orchestra mean to you? What skills do you focus on? Have you developed? We'll be speaking to a couple of our former orchestral scholars who have joined us, and to find out what they've been up to and whether orchestra has fed into their lives, or maybe they've completely run away from it in the other direction, screaming. And we have a very, very special guest, Thomas Hancox, who has worked with our students in our side-by-side programs with the London Mozart Players, and he's has vast orchestral, chamber and solo experience, and also is passionate about working with young people. So really super excited that Tom could join us as a representative from the professional world. So we'll get started. I just thought I'd give a brief introduction, and then we'll open up I'll open up the session with Tom Hancox and ask him a few questions. Then we'll hear from our former students, and then we'll open up to our current scholars. So several different sections. And I hope you can all hear me. Is that, yes, I didn't check, but yes, do give a nod. Okay, fantastic. So what is an orchestra and why are they important? Just very briefly, as I gave a session on this last week, as I said, it's working as a team. It's working together as a collective of individuals who are there for a higher goal. They're there for an uplifting goal. We work in just the same way we work in a community. We bring our individual contributions as individual musicians. We spend years and years and years training as individuals, and then we come together and we are a percentage of a whole. And knowing our role on stage as a percentage of that whole is really, really key to creating something that we couldn't do on our own. It involves an incredible amount of listening and intensely listening to each other, intensely listening to yourself and blending that listening. And it involves a lot of swallowing a bit of yourself for the sake of the whole. It involves leadership, flexibility, adaptability. You've got to be able to think on your toes and react on your toes, because every moment involves some sort of reaction and proaction and listening. So it keeps us all on our toes all the time. In these times of social distancing, it becomes ever more important, the aspects of communication that we use on stage. And I've been thinking quite a lot about what are those aspects of communication that we still have over Zoom and over the computers, and what are we really, really lacking? And there is definitely, I think we can all agree that there's definitely something lacking with having a session like this, as opposed to having you all in the room. When I stop, for example, for a breath, there's no atmosphere here in this room by myself. But when you stop, so the role of silence and pauses, I've been thinking a lot about, and what sort of role that has in our communities and our human interactions. So there's a few things that I've been thinking about. In terms of the Orchestral Scholarship Program, for those who don't know, we've got a program of choral scholarships and orchestral scholarships at Royal Holloway, and we'll be talking a little bit more about what that means to our students. In terms of the role that orchestra takes at our university, I believe absolutely passionately that no matter whether the students are whatever they're going to do next, whether they're going to be musicians or whether they're going to do something completely different, I think the orchestra has all of these qualities and develops all of these skills, as I've been talking about, that hopefully students can take them to whatever they do next. So a development of confidence, a development of confidence in how they communicate with their peers, and how they take on leadership roles, how they develop a sense of professionalism and a quality of whatever they do, hard work. All of these skills and all of these qualities are relevant to any field in which they might find themselves in. And I hope that it does enhance their studies in this way. I hope that certainly it will. I hope it will enhance if they're studying music. I'm hoping that the repertoire will tie in with their courses that they may be taking. That some of the concepts we're talking about in terms of harmony and phrasing and musical elements will coordinate with their courses. But for those who are outside of music, I hope that attention to detail, the listening skills, the communication skills, I hope they also coordinate with other courses, and I'd be very interested to hear from some of our students, especially who are joint honors students or people who are have done something outside the profession afterwards, how that relates. It also gives a social aspect, which of course we're all missing at the moment, but it gives a chance for people of all departments and walks of life to come together. And even within the music department, sometimes students don't see each other, but they see each other at orchestra. And there is definitely a social element to it, coming together once a week for a rehearsal, and the dynamic in that room with the different personalities who are there certainly provides in much the way a sports team or an extracurricular activity as such. So it's both, I see it as both curricular and extracurricular. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. I think we'll touch on some of those aspects when it's more of a discussion rather than just the sound of my own voice, which I get quite tired of on these sessions. But I think keep track of your questions and raise your hand. I suppose there is that function, isn't it? I'm so used to Teams, I'm not as used to Zoom, so I suppose there is that function of raising your hand, but literally if there isn't, then just put your hand up if you've got a question to raise. I will open up for discussions at various different points. First, we'll speak to Tom Hancox, who is here. As Nathan mentioned, just a little bit about Tom. He is principal flute of the Northern Ballet and co-principal of Britain's Sinfonia. He works regularly as guest principal of many other orchestras and has done so with the Royal Philharmonic, the London Philharmonic, Philharmonia Orchestra, Academy of St. Martin in Fields, English National Opera, English Chamber Orchestra, many others. He's already blushing over there, I can see him. So he's very active as a chamber musician, and also is, interestingly, chief executive of the Cavatina Chamber Music Trust. Is that still current, Tom? I hope. Which is a charity that introduces and makes available chamber music to young people, which is a very, very, very interesting role. He has visited us on many occasions as part of our side-by-side project. This is one thing that I have introduced at Royal Holloway, which I'm very, very excited about. We have side-by-side sessions with professional musicians, mostly from the London Mozart Players, sometimes from outside of that organization, and we have extensive number of rehearsals where the students sit side by side with professional musicians, and then we perform together as well, which is a really unique opportunity, I think, that we offer. And I know that is something that has been a feature and an exciting feature in our Orchestral Scholarship program. Tom, so I have a couple of questions for you in terms of, well, my first question, I guess, is what makes a great orchestral musician?
Yeah, well, hello everyone, and thank you very much for the invite to come and join you all. I think you used one word which for me, above all others, stands out in defining an orchestral musician, and I think it's flexibility. If I had to choose just one word, that would be it. Because as you also alluded to, Rebecca, I think playing in an orchestra is a case that the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. And to be able to be that one part that contributes to that unbalanced equation, that extraordinary equation of playing in an orchestra, then we have to be flexible. And we have to be able to compromise all the time. Now, compromise can, first of all, take quite technical form. For example, that might mean that we have to play as sharp or as flat, or as quiet or as loud as the relative context demands of us. And that's already an example where we've departed from any sort of absolute notion that we might have in our practice room, anything that tells us that we're absolutely, lined up on the green dot of our tuning machine or whatever. That, to a certain extent, goes out of the window when it comes to actually playing with others, because actually the right thing in the context is the thing that fits. And so, yes, in terms of intonation and dynamics, but of course, then that also expands to sort of slightly greater musical questions, I think. And again, you alluded to this, Rebecca, the balance of one's personal ego, expectation, wishes, and things like that, and how they fit into a collective whole. I mean, it might be that you have a very strong musical reaction against what the orchestra at large is doing, what you're being told to do specifically. But again, you have to have the flexibility to attain to that and fit into that and make sure that you can be as convincing and persuasive in that role as possible. And those are things that I think are particularly pronounced in an orchestral setting. Why? Well, practically, first of all, there are many more people in an orchestra than there are in, say, a chamber group, and certainly when you're acting in the role as soloist. Of course, that's not to say that you don't have to have flexibility in those roles. You still have to have it to a tremendous degree, but I think, particularly as an orchestral musician, because the scales are so balanced between you and everyone else, one does have to be particularly adaptable. So I think, first and foremost, yes, you are a flexible musician if you're playing in orchestras. How's that for starters?
Yeah, that's great. As you were talking, you picked up on one thing in terms of if you don't agree with what's going on around you, and don't hesitate just because I'm a conductor to say that, so what happens if you don't agree with a tempo that, I mean, whether it's in chamber music, I guess in chamber music you can stop and you can talk about it. Oftentimes there's not time to do that in orchestra, and it's the conductor's job to sort of set the tempo. How do you deal with that, whether it's to do with tempo, whether it's maybe to do specifically with a solo passage, and you don't agree with what the conductor's asking you to do?
I think, everything there is contextual. Certain ensembles, certain orchestras, and I think there is a relationship perhaps between their size, will have, greater familiarity or experience or expectation that there might be more dialogue between various sides. But obviously, we know we have a certain history of, and there's a certain tradition, particularly we think in sort of symphonic repertoire of, a maestro maybe raining down a particular interpretation, and we all sort of suck it up. And, I have certainly seen people try, sometimes successfully and not successfully, alter their fates in terms of, say, a tempo for a solo, or the amount of freedom they're afforded, or whatever, or the surrounding accompaniment, how that's balanced, things like that. Of course, those are all contextual, but those are also all just tests of your flexibility, really. I can think of so many examples immediately where one has been asked to do something that actually you've never contemplated, but actually those experiences then go on to inform your practice. And so when you're preparing that part for the next time you play that piece, you already have entertained another possibility. And I think that's always a great thing to be doing in practice, that you actually think, right, I'm now going to play it, and another absolute extreme, so that you're then preparing yourself to cover the entire musical compass, and then hopefully somebody will point out yet another direction, and that's going to improve you as a musician, no doubt. I'm sure about that.
Yes, I was going to touch on that, because I can imagine, as preparing, if let's say you don't know the orchestra, you don't know the conductor, you don't know what the conductor is going to ask you to do, you don't know what, say you're preparing for, Debussy Prelude, you don't know whether they're going to conduct it or not, you don't know what speed they're going to want it. I mean, it's very difficult to prepare for those situations. I suppose you need to practice it five different ways. I remember being in a lesson with my daughter on the violin, and she was debating she was playing some Bach, and she was playing from an edition that had certain articulation in it, and a different edition that had different articulation. Sort of what do I do? Do I do it this edition, this edition? They're both included in the Barenreiter book that I bought. What do I do? And we said, well, why don't you try Monday, Wednesday, Friday doing it this way, and Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday doing it that way, and then you can decide later. And in terms of, I guess, the more tools that you have in your quiver, what is it, that the more arrows you've got, the more tools that you have, then if somebody asks you to do it this way or that way, you have sort of almost anticipated it, if not exactly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that. And then I think one also sees more and more now that that sort of flexibility and adaptability also applies to you, not just in a musical setting, but also you as a person, that you're perhaps not abrasive, or what I'm trying to say is that you're a good colleague to people, and that, yes, of course, you listen to them musically and you react to them, but also that you allow people space. I mean, it's a very strange thing that, of course, orchestras are wonderfully diverse in terms of character, the collection, and yet somehow at the end of it you get this coherent musical artistic expression. And I think a great pleasure is that actually, whilst we come together in one actually very focused way, then when we stop playing and we talk to each other, we recognize that we are very, very different people. I'm sure that applies to many work settings, but this is the one I know. And being somebody who can listen and is adaptable, calm, flexible, all of these things, I think is really, really important, perhaps particularly in the UK, where we don't have particularly fine working conditions for orchestras. We turn things round in a very, very short space of time. And so being sort of supportive of people who might be under more stress than you or something like that is really significant. Just actually what I was thinking of when you were talking about preparing parts in lots of different ways. I mean, I know we're all now staring at screens all day, every day because of the lockdown, but in normal times, I think this is where screens are now really, really useful, because you can go to YouTube in particular and look up any orchestral piece and find a multitude of performances, which is useful, yes, okay, for hearing how every different phrase can be cornered in particular fashions, but also because you can see very often how different conductors will beat it. And particularly when I play something for the first time, I'll identify, and I'm sure we'll talk about preparing an orchestral part, but actually there are always specific little corners which I'll start to worry about, because I'll actually think, well, how am I going to get that with the basses over there and the violins there, and actually how's that change of tempo going to be shown? And if, again, in terms of preparation and entertaining all the different possible expressions and outcomings that could appear, actually watching those videos on YouTube I find invaluable, because you'll see that 8 times out of 10 the subdivision will start in this bar or whatever, or some people give you freedom there or whatever it is. But actually thinking about all of those possibilities means that when you look up and actually the beats are coming down for you, you know exactly where you're going to be.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I do want to touch on preparation for orchestral rehearsals and sort of the idea of preparing your individual line for joining everybody else. But I did want to ask you, what are and maybe you've already touched on these already, what qualities do you notice that need most work in young musicians in terms of their orchestral playing? What's the thing that maybe you've already said it in terms of flexibility, but if there's something else that comes off the list?
Well, now I sort of have to show my colours a little bit, in that obviously I play the flute, and so I'm in one part of the orchestra which has a sort of quite specific role, and I think the role, particularly in the wind and brass, I mean, these are essentially all relatively soloistic roles. What I often notice working with, say, orchestras, youth orchestras, training orchestras, this sort of thing, is that actually it's the ability to project solos, or indeed just at least inform and inflect even tutti passage work in a way that actually is going to carry. Now, I don't mean necessarily just playing very loudly, but I do think that is actually important, and getting players, particularly in woodwind as opposed to brass, to develop a sound that is going to carry is very hard, because actually when we practice in rooms like the one I'm speaking to you, where the walls are pretty close, you get used to playing in a certain way so that your ears aren't overloaded, and then all of a sudden you go into 1,000, 2,000 seater auditorium And it's very important that the people at the back are still actually receiving not only all the information, but they're receiving it in as much contrast as possible, and learning how to gauge that change in sound, that the people at the back can hear everything, but can still also hear all the inflections of from pianissimo through to fortissimo and everything else in between. That's quite difficult, I think. And that's something I think you just learn through doing it, which is why I think this program is so good. For string players, I can't speak for experience, but I know that orchestral string playing is a really, really specialist technique, actually, because there it's about your ability to blend and cohere a sound. And that's a very different question, but it's not one that I'm licensed or authorized to speak about. But I would say that the thing I notice most of all, particularly in woodwind, but perhaps also even in brass, although they typically don't have the same challenges in acoustic projection, but then we do get into the questions of preparing parts and knowing which bits are really important in terms of sharing and pronouncing, as it were, across the orchestra. I mean, if you think about composers, and particularly in a time when they were writing by hand, and not only were they writing by hand, but they weren't doing it with useful writing implements, but you know, they had a quill and ink and scratchy paper. The effort for a composer to put notes on a page and then to give us any detail whatsoever about how to play them is really considerable. And so it's then worth sort of thinking always, well, why did they do that? Why did they make the effort to give us notes as well, even if they're the same as the first violins in the case of the the flute parts, for example? And what do I bring to the party? Yeah, so that would be my sort of main observation.
That's great. It's really, really interesting, especially because we do all practice in small practice rooms, and then adjusting to this big space. And personally, I think, I don't know whether you would agree with this. I think that the projection doesn't just come with, and I say the same thing to my conducting students as well. Projection doesn't just come with physical projection, but it's actually to do with musical ideas and confidence of musical ideas. If you are super, super confident in your musical ideas and you really believe what you're saying, then you will project it to the room, just like if you're talking to a group of people and you really have to believe in what you're saying and really know what you're saying and say. So it's almost like you really have to speak it to the conductor, and the conductor kind of helps translate it. And then the other thing you mentioned about the violins, in terms of your place in the orchestra, in terms of you're actually sitting on the wrong side of the violins all the time, in terms of their F holes facing out to the audience as opposed to back. Is it very, very different sitting out in the audience when you go to an orchestra concert, for example, than when you're sitting in the flute section? How different is that? And then, if there are string players who you feel, project as well, or do they have to sort of project to you? And what are your thoughts on that for a moment?
Yeah, well, lots of thoughts just came to my mind then. I mean, one that I think is interesting for everybody, I hope, is that I find it really interesting now when I go and listen to an orchestra concert. And I'm thinking when I go and hear maybe, say, a professional symphony orchestra playing in a big hall, Busman's Holiday and all of that. I mean, it's really interesting. For example, I don't know if any of you have ever been to a symphony concert in the Royal Festival Hall. Now, I don't think the acoustic there is very good. In fact, I think it's pretty duff. And it's really interesting. If you sit kind of midway back through the hall, let alone further back, the sound is very, very distant in there. It sounds very small. It sounds like you're listening to it from a long way away. I mean, in fact, you are listening to it from quite a long way away. You end up, many meters away. And I always find it remarkable listening to the different orchestras in there, how they do or don't adapt to that. I would say I observe sort of particular patterns in that as well, but I'm not going to go into it. But actually, that is something that a good conductor can help address, because obviously we never really know how we sound at any given distance, but particularly when you end up in a hall unknown to you, which is of a very different disposition, layout, whatever. So that's something I really enjoy listening to, is hearing different orchestras in spaces that I do and don't know, and thinking about how they're coping with the acoustics. I find that really, really interesting. A few years ago, I was in in Israel, and I had a night off, and I went to hear the Israel Philharmonic. Now, I'd heard the Israel Philharmonic once live before when they played at the Proms in the Royal Albert Hall about probably about 8 or 9 years ago, and that was it was an amazing concert, but it was a very horrible one because their performance had been disrupted by protesters, and the BBC had to take it off the air. And so I was so excited to hear the Israel Phil in their home in Tel Aviv in this auditorium. And I mean, it's a wonderful orchestra. It just makes, and particularly the string sound, it's so rich. I absolutely love it. And it's amazing because it's a really, really terrible hall, I realized. And it was very interesting hearing how different members of the orchestra were clearly compensating, adjusting, doing things with their sound that weren't necessarily what we would expect, but they were making those adjustments, presumably because they were also very familiar with it, so that the kind of sonic result for me as an audience member was pleasant, it was musical, it was effective, exciting, etc., etc. So yeah, I think that's good. In terms of, yes, the relationship between the layout of the orchestra and how we hear things, it's wonderful to try different layouts, I have to say. I've done some Haydn symphonies where we've had the woodwind at the very front. I really enjoy that. It's much, that's quite interesting in as much as all of a sudden, and in fact, we changed halfway through the week, and all of a sudden the conductor, who had been sort of saying, please play louder a lot of the time, was suddenly sort of saying, please play more quietly. Now, I thought that was interesting because actually, if anything, we were already playing more quietly because we were where we were so close. I mean, it's not that much of a difference, but all of a sudden, if you're up close and personal, as it were, that is something that you already rebalance. But your ability to communicate ideas with the conductor and for them to help you play together, I mean, it was so much easier. And similarly, a few years ago, I remember, and pardon the name check, but it was with St. Martin in the Fields, and it was Murray Pariah, and he was directing from the piano, and we were doing Beethoven piano concertos, all Beethoven piano concertos. And it was quite a tough tour. He plays, when he has it in the orchestra, he has the piano going off at an angle, kind of if we were in a conventional setup, between the violas and the cellos. And he has the lid up on full stick so that you can't really see him very easily from where the woodwinds are off at an angle. And actually, to be honest, when everyone's playing, you can't hear him very clearly. And that's a great shame because, I mean, he's possibly the greatest pianist alive at the moment. I don't know, but I mean, he's amazing. And he would sometimes sort of stop and say, look, guys, don't you get it? Can't you hear what I'm doing? And no, we couldn't hear what he was doing. I mean, everything was so loud, and that when you're actually playing yourself, it already is very hard to hear other people. And then particularly when he's saying, well, I need to hear you there, and I need to hear you there, play louder, or whatever, or play quieter, blimey. And so then, again, for a while, for some of the rehearsals, we woodwinds went and sat round him. And it was amazing because all of a sudden, all of these musical ideas, and I mean, he's so thoughtful, but also so spontaneous. It was so clear what he wanted because we could hear. And I said to him, and this is, it wasn't a risky idea. I felt confident to say it, but I said, why don't we play a concert like this? I mean, the answer is because it's too hard actually for the strings, who then get moved out. But for us, it was suddenly so much easier. And it did make me appreciate that, there are geographic advantages and disadvantages to how an orchestra is laid out. And similarly, I think the greatest disadvantage we in the wind and brass can face is when we turn up at a venue and we're all on the flat. It can be because the projection becomes harder because suddenly we have a body of instrumentalists in front of us. But I think what's harder still is actually the visual communication across the orchestra, particularly because you just can't see bows so clearly. So you can't see when sound is going to start or finish. And you also can't see in the same way how notes are going to be articulated, how they're going to start and be pronounced. It's so easy to watch a bow because, a fine string player just has a sort of natural gravity to the way they set up any particular notes, and you can learn just from that sort of arc of placement, or whether it's very close or whatever, how it's all going to commence. if you're on the flat, you can't see that very easily, and then you're sort of craning just to see a beat to make sure that you're roughly in the right place. Anyway, those were a few thoughts that just came to me from what you were saying.
That's fascinating. I mean, it's just fascinating insight into how what the kind of things you think about, and I hope that the students have gleaned how much Tom does think about and look and listen and studying the score and realizing where he fits in and why is he doubling the violins. That of course involves being aware of the other parts and looking at the score and listening to the score before the rehearsal and all of that you're sort of aware of where you fit within. Just before we get to the next part of the discussion about with our former orchestral scholars, I wanted to ask you one final question in terms of well, first of all, if you think that there's something that our orchestral program could do in the future, something that could be added to it in terms of your experience with our side-by-side programs, and then, well, maybe if you want to just touch on the kind of what you might see as the role of orchestras coming out of this COVID. That it's a very difficult question, and nobody really knows. But if you have any inkling, alternatively, if you'd rather answer a sort of just general advice for our students, what's one piece of advice you might give us? Your thoughts on one of the above?
Yeah, I'll try and do all three very quickly. First of all, one piece of advice was a piece of advice I was probably given at about the age of, say, 30 years now. And that was, practice now because you won't have the time again. That basically was the best bit of advice I was ever given, and I took it on pretty seriously. As it turns out, I didn't know that about 12 years later that actually we would all suddenly stop in our tracks, and there would be, for some of us, lots of time for practice again. But by and large, now is the time to practice, because actually, yes, it is quite sort of hectic and busy once you're up and running. And it's a bit like painting whatever it is, Seventh Bridge. You start just reminding yourself how to articulate again, but then your fingers have forgotten what to do, or whatever it is. So now, whilst you have the time, make use of it if that's what floats your boat. In terms of what the program does, I mean, I just think it's so wonderful. First of all, you have the support of Royal Holloway clearly, through and through, and that you have this this very happy communion of London Mozart Players working with the orchestra. I think that's terrific, and I've enjoyed very much the concerts I've been a part of, either as an audience member or actually sitting in and amongst everyone's work. The tricky thing with orchestras is that people are employed very, very differently, aren't they? You think about certain repertoire in which the brass will only play in fast movements. They won't even touch their instruments in the slow movements, whereas the strings might have even more thousands of notes in the slow movements. And so actually using time like that is really difficult. And I wonder, when normality returns, if there might be a way that not even doing such large sectionals, but even just doing very, very focused sectionals for certain instruments. It depends on personnel, but I think that could be very valuable, a one-off use of time, so that very specific things can be addressed. It's never a perfect solution, because sometimes even with us in a section, the difference between the first and a second part can be huge, but at least you will be working in the same instrument. And that brings me on to when normality returns. Well, I mean, first of all, I'd just like to say, I think, I feel sorry for very, very many people, full stop, a lot of the time. But I think particularly in lockdown, I've been feeling very sorry for students and those recently graduated, because I think it's just so sad that life at that particularly exciting moment where you are has had to stop to a significant degree. And I know, and I just applaud your versatility and your resilience. And I'm so pleased to see you all here and obviously engaged, albeit at a distance and in very testing circumstances. And I think, that sort of optimism is really, really important. So I hope that before too long, we will be back together. making live music. I presume it's going to start small. We've already seen a little bit over the past 4 weeks at Wigmore Hall. They've been doing live lunchtime concerts, which are all on YouTube, or you can listen again. Some amazing performances, only duos. Maybe in the coming month, I've already seen that quartets are starting to do stuff. Great, terrific. And I hope that before too long, that will, we'll hopefully see exponential growth, a bit like we saw that horrible curve at the beginning of this lockdown period, and we were sort of plotting it. Well, let's hope that a similar sort of growth can occur, and then that we will sustain forever and again that sort of plateau of live music making with as many people and as many people in the audience as we could possibly want. It is interesting to see whether, it will be interesting to see whether some of the music festivals that are going online now this summer, for example, I think York Early Music Festival is trying to do an online program. This is really interesting for audiences because instead of buying a festival ticket as a personal attendee, i.e. an attendee in each of the venues, which will cost you £100 or so, I don't know. Now you can buy a £10 ticket for your household and you can view everything that will be on in the festival. Now, it's good for us as an audience member because it's much cheaper and it's much more convenient. It could be fantastic for the festival because actually, instead of being limited by the capacity of a church, they could have audiences of tens of thousands of people. I don't think it's likely, but it's a possibility. And whether people are able to monetize that in the meantime might change how we use venues, certainly in the foreseeable future. And I'm hopeful, and I do hear plenty of messages that people really value live music and they want it back in their lives as immediately as possible. But this might be sort of the next step on that journey.
Great. Well, wonderful thoughts from you, Tom. And yes, I hope very soon. I'm still waiting for the green light from the college in terms of how many people we can fit in each venue. But I do hope that we're planning to have students on campus in the autumn, where if students can be on campus and they can be in socially distanced rooms sitting in lectures, then I am going to push as hard as I can for having them sit in the Windsor Auditorium, even if they're just 10 of them together, just some sort of music making together. And I do agree with you about, I've been trying to really think, what can we do in this time that we don't have time to do at other times in our life? And I'm sure everybody's had that long list of lockdown things that we should have gotten done by now, and we haven't. We've eaten lots of chocolate and drunk lots of beer probably, but maybe we've got something done in the garden. But I do think we do need to take these times, these strange times, and try to make something with it, for lack of a cliche, sort of lemonade out of lemons. But I really think there is opportunity, and I plan to try to use that in the autumn to really dig into things that we wouldn't normally have time to do when we're just rehearsing and preparing for a concert at the end of the term. So I do hope to make use of all of the wonderful people such as yourself who have come and have you join sessions and really doing some perhaps much more in-depth work than we have had time to do. We do have that continued pressure of performance, don't we? And sometimes when that's taken away, and I've been in other situations where we've said, what if we don't have that pressure of performance at the end? What can we do? And it does open the mind in terms of the things that we don't have time to do in the orchestral setting in this country in particular. So it's wonderful to hear your thoughts. Tom, you're welcome to stay for the rest of the session. Tom might dip out and do some practice and join us again in the latter part, but you're more than welcome to stay. But my huge thanks for your wonderful thoughts. I could listen to you all afternoon and pick your brain all afternoon, but I wanted to get to some of our students who have taken the time to join us as well. So thank you so much for your thoughts on that, and maybe we'll have some future sessions on Zoom in terms of in the autumn with our students. I think that would be really worth doing.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you for the invite. What I am going to do exactly is I'm going to do half an hour's practice, and then I'll come back for the last quarter of an hour, and if there are any questions, I'd be very happy to add my penny's worth.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom. So yes, he's going to go do some practice. Yeah, put yourself on mute. There we go. Good. Okay. Fantastic. Well, we'll move on to the next section, in which I'm very pleased to see some of our former orchestral scholars who've joined us. We're going to hear from two in particular. Benjamin Isaac, there you are. I'm just trying to find everybody, and Sophie Bayliss. I'm not going to introduce you. I want you to introduce yourselves. But just for me to have a chance to say that, you know, it was such a great pleasure. I also see Rock Lee was down there as well. I didn't prepare him to speak, but welcome. And these are the wonderful students who joined our orchestral scholarship program. And I have a few questions for you, but maybe first, Ben, can you start by introducing yourself?
Hi, I'm Ben. I left Holloway about 2 years ago now, which has gone way too quickly. And I was one of the first orchestral scholars that when it was introduced back in 2016. Yeah, so I was one of the first who was orchestral scholar. I'm a violinist, and since leaving Holloway, I've just finished my master's at Birmingham Conservatoire, studying the violin. But yeah, that's me.
Great. Welcome, Ben. Wonderful to have you with us. And Sophie, would you like to say a few words?
Hello, I'm Sophie, and I left Holloway 3 years ago, I think, which it seems like a long time ago, and I'm not sure I can remember much from Holloway. But yeah, I played the flute, and I was also one of the first orchestral scholars, the first cohort. And I now work at Hampton Court Palace. I work with the choir who sing in the chapel there. So although I'm not directly involved in orchestral playing, I'm involved with a choir. So there's lots of overlapping things there.
Great, wonderful to have you both with us. The questions that I'd like you to address, and I'll give you a choice again, so as not to put you on the spot and give you a chance to think about them, is generally sort of, well, what are you doing now, which you've addressed already, but how did you see orchestral playing when you were involved in orchestras at Royal Holloway? How has that enriched your life in what you're doing now, and what memories do you have from it? If it hasn't enriched your life and you'd rather say what memories, then feel free to say that. Feel free to say, well, Sophie's already said it. She says she can't remember anything from Royal Holloway. So there we are. But do you feel that orchestra offered you something that you're using now in whatever you're busy with now? Maybe let's start with Sophie.
Okay, in terms of this, absolutely, orchestra did wonders for me, and so in so many different ways, especially sort of building confidence. I was quite an anxious performer before having the responsibilities of playing in orchestra and being an orchestral scholar, but just having to assume more of a responsibility for not only for your section but the whole teamwork thing in an orchestra. It was so beneficial to I didn't have a choice. I had to sort of become more confident in order to play better, communicate better with the section, without even thinking about it. And I think it was almost like became a subconscious thing that has just changed the way I approach different situations now in life, not just in music or orchestral playing now. And I think definitely, aside from orchestral playing as well, the networking opportunities that there were sort of before concerts, when we had the little receptions before concerts, and just talking to different people who were interested in the orchestral scholarship program, and what it was like to be in an orchestra. Just that interaction with different people from various walks of life, and also, you know, business people who were not necessarily so aware of music. Just talking to different people and networking, I thought was probably one of the main things that's helped me in my career now. So
Do you think that development of confidence, have you taken that now to your interviews and jobs and things that you're doing now?
Yeah, most definitely. I work a lot with sort of choristers now, and I mean they're aged between 7 and 13 or something, and I never thought I would work with children, but having to communicate with them and then talking to their parents, it relies on sort of changing the way you approach different situations and different levels of communication, and I just think having just more confidence to be able to approach those sorts of conversations and discussions, and often some discussions, you know, talking to parents about difficult situations or something that, you know, they're maybe concerning their children, it makes me a lot calmer to know that I've got sort of more confidence to approach those situations.
Brilliant. And Benjamin, what about you? How is your time at orchestras at Holloway informed what you're doing now?
Well, I think most of it is the experience I had at Holloway definitely sent me down the path of actually trying to become a musician. Then I did a John Donner's whilst I was at Holloway. I did maths and music, and hated maths, so that was also a factor in it as well. But it also helped me then decide that actually I wanted to try and become a professional musician, which then led me to applying for postgrads at music colleges, and then graduating now, and then hopefully once the world comes to some sort of normality, applying for jobs and things like that, really. But yeah, I definitely have to say that the experience I had at Holloway led a lot to me going down that path and towards music and trying to become a professional musician.
Is there one particular project or one particular performance that stands out in your mind, Ben?
I think all the LMP projects were great, were amazing. But personally, it had to be Scheherazade. It was a big challenge as an individual. Not really being second, you're only starting to really kind of find my own feet in a way as well. And then having to perform a piece like that was such a big section, which I hadn't really done before. Definitely a unique opportunity, and I'll never forget.
Oh, that's great. One of the things that I love seeing in all of our orchestral projects is people coming and saying, I didn't think I could do that, and I worked really hard, and now I can do that. And I can see that with my children as well, that you know, the satisfaction of setting an ambitious goal for themselves and then actually accomplishing it. There's nothing better. So I love seeing that I set a challenge in front of the orchestra and they rise to it. I mean, I remember actually that I think Sophie, there were tears when I made you principal flute, and you said, I don't know what I can do with this. I'm overwhelmed, and I sort of gave you that chance, and you really rose to it. You really grew into that position, which I think you said to me, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you said to me, you never would have imagined yourself in a principal flute position, and having the opportunity to sit next to a professional musician. So do you have anything to say about that, Sophie?
Only that you're completely right. And I always obviously played in orchestras when I was sort of growing up before university, but yeah, didn't have much confidence in my ability. It's drawing on what Tom said earlier about the whole projection thing. I didn't really believe in myself that I could play, principal flute and have these solos and project them and put emotion into them. There were so many parts of leading a section as well. There were just so many different sort of strands of, I don't know, whatever to put into doing a good job in not only playing the role but sort of leading the section as well. And I didn't think that I'd be able to do all of those things at once. And
Yeah, and sometimes, as Tom said, you just have to get in there and do it and learn learn as you do it,
Absolutely.
because there's
I
not much.
don't really think I thought about how I was going to approach each rehearsal. You just take it as it comes and then learn from each session and build on it. So.
Sorry, I think I've got a bit of a delay here. I'm not sure. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry if I spoke on top of you. It seemed like you'd stopped. Great. We have a couple of other old orchestral scholars here. If any of them want to jump in, is Rock still here? He's disappeared from. Oh no, there he is. And Peter, Leticia, anything you two want to add to the mix of old scholars? Well, Peter's still been at Royal Holloway. He was undergraduate and is now in his masters, and Rock left at the same time as Benjamin. So do each one of you want to say one quick sentence about your thoughts on the program?
Yeah, I thought it was really useful actually in putting people in a leadership role with that cushion of support. So for me, obviously I've gone on to do conducting as a postgraduate, but the experiences of rehearsing and taking sectionals as an orchestral scholar was part of a formative experience of being able to, in a safe environment, learn how to rehearse without wasting people's time and without having to put yourself on that platform in front of 60, 70 people, but rather 10 or 15. So that's the main thing I got out of it.
Rock, do you want to have a moment on the soapbox?
Yeah, kind of similarly to Pete and Ben, it was great to have that sort of training, but also that that level of support while we're taking on these leadership positions. Similarly to Ben, I went on to conservatoire because I wanted to try and become a professional musician. So I've been studying at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland for the past 2 years. But I think unlike Ben, I am now more actively considering other options because I think unlike most people here, I don't have the cushion of citizenship, which makes finding an orchestral seat much more difficult. Yeah.
Ah, yes, that comes into it. So yes, well, my personal plea would be for you not to give up. Rock, for those of you who weren't with us to join, was co-leader of the orchestra and also played a phenomenal concerto. Is it in your third year, Rock? Was it your final year of the Barber Violin Concerto, which he worked at tremendously hard and gave a fantastic performance of it in the end. And I remember him coming to me maybe at the end of his first year, maybe it was the beginning of the second year, saying, I really want to bring the Barber Violin Concerto to the orchestral audition. Do you think it's a good idea? Do you think I should? And I said, that's fine. It's very, very ambitious, but don't come and play me the first movement because that's easy. I want to hear you come, make sure that you can play the last movement because for those of you who don't know the Barber, it's quite lyrical. It's not easy at all, actually. It's very beautiful and lyrical, but then you get to these first two movements, which are expansive in their nature, and the third movement, which is just it's a moto perpetuo, it's perpetual motion. It just from start to finish, you are out of the box and you are sprinting round the track and there's non-stop until the end. So it's a huge contrast, and some people do come and play the first movement of a concerto and then you discover throughout the process that their first movement was great but they didn't quite have time to prepare a second and third movement. So you do have to think about that when you're preparing a concerto audition, maybe to take excerpts from different movements to show. But Rock did not let me down. How do you see that experience now, a couple of years out, Rock?
I still look back on it quite fondly, I think. I actually got Claire to record it from the back of the auditorium. So I've still got that. There's a few moments where when, if I do, dig it up and look back at it, there's a few moments that I think I do differently now. And certainly I've spent more time on it now as a sort of romantic concerto to have kind of in the folder for auditions and all that. So I certainly look at it differently now. I treat it differently. I think I probably play it better now. I'd hope so anyway. But yeah, it's definitely one of the kind of biggest musical experiences I've ever had.
Well, it's great, and it's interesting having recordings, isn't it? When I listen to my recordings, I really have a physical memory of how I felt during that performance. And, you know, of course I would do things differently now, but it's sometimes very painful to go back and listen to recordings, and other times it's quite enlightening because you think how maybe you would do it the same. Maybe you thought, oh, actually that was really quite good. In my mind, I didn't remember it being quite that good. Usually it's the opposite. Usually it's I remember it being better than it actually is. But it is interesting having that kind of concrete proof, you know, in your hands of something that you can go back and listen to, because live music is so much not like that. It disappears as soon as it's out there, and you just have to relish every moment of it. Well, does anybody else, any of our former scholars, have anything else they want to add to that mix before I move on to our current scholars? Any other thoughts that you wanted to share? Now I've stumped them. Right, good. Well, please feel free to contribute to the conversation as we move on as well, because it's so wonderful to have you here. And sometimes when I'm asking these questions to others, it's also good if you can weigh in as well. I'll open up to our current cohort of scholars who are here, and I guess we'll start with the. I don't know whether we'll have time to get to everybody. I have sort of something to ask everybody, but maybe we'll start with the first four as we initially talked about. We're going to start first with Kieran. Is he here? Yes, he's down there. Hi, Kieran.
Hello.
I'll just give you a chance to introduce. Just say, you know, who you are, what year you are, what you're studying, and I think when we talked about preparing for this, it was sort of where you've come from and the difference between where you've come from and university life, small town Cornwall to big town Egham, that sort of thing. If you would, Kieran.
Well, I'm Kieran. I'm second year going into third year music student at Royal Holloway. I come from Cornwall, as Rebecca said, and to put it in kind of perspective, the only youth symphony orchestra in the county is the size of Royal Holloway Symphony Orchestra, if not smaller. And that's with, I think, based on campus and out of all the young musicians in Cornwall, drawing from about the same kind of pool of musicians in terms of size. So there was an element of big fish, small pond, moving into the big pond of the university campus. But in terms of how it's been far easier than that has made it sound, for two reasons. One is that I think the youth music making we have in Cornwall is far better than it has any right to be. Mostly because of several professionals who have decided to get out of the rat race and go down to Cornwall, where there's, you know, the big views and the 20-minute drives before you get anywhere, for like a sense of escape, I guess, at the end of their professional careers. The other thing is the Orchestral Scholarship program, which has really done wonders to, for me personally, encourage me to keep doing some of the stuff that I had been starting to do towards the end of my time in the youth orchestras in Cornwall, through just being given that support in leadership that a lot of people have been talking about previously, and just to give that little nudge to develop my skills further, both playing and in the sort of front of the section role.
Sorry, muted. Couldn't find the unmute button. Fantastic. Yeah, Kieran's been leading the cellos and doing an absolutely wonderful job. Really embraced the role. Again, I'm always put in this position of sort of choosing who's leading and who's following. A very, very difficult decisions that I have to make as a conductor. And we audition our orchestra every year, which is time consuming for all of us, but I think one is important for the students to do auditions every year, because auditions you can only get better at them the more you do them. So it's just a good experience to do that every year. But then it gives a chance for us to start at an equal footing every year, so that everybody has a chance to audition and build to that. But I always have to make these difficult choices as to who sits in front, and often it's not the person who comes in and plays the best. Often it's somebody who comes in and something about their audition, something about their personality, the way they make eye contact with me, or the way they engage in conversation, makes me think, yeah, this person should have something to grow into, and certainly I can see that in all the people in front of me, actually, that I thought very hard about where I put them in the orchestra before I assigned them. I'd like to hear from Nima next. And Nima, just introduce yourself. Nima's a viola player in the orchestra, and I'll let her introduce but also talk to your previous orchestral experience. She's a very experienced orchestral player before she came to Royal Holloway, and how your experience differs in what you had before and what you've experienced so far at Royal Holloway.
Hi, my name's Nima. I'm going into my third year studying music, play the viola. Yeah, I've done a lot of orchestral schemes and projects growing up from East London, and there's always been loads of projects for musicians that come from less developed areas. So organisations such as the London Symphony Orchestra and the London Philharmonic Orchestra, they have certain schemes that are only for people in East London, like the LSO on track scheme. And I got to play with loads of renowned conductors like Simon Rattle, Valery Gergiev, what is his name? Dudamel, yeah. And those experiences, because I was young, I didn't really get to properly enjoy them as much as I would have now, because I know who they are. I don't used to know. I wasn't very in tune with music when I was younger. It was more of a hobby. But when I got to the age of 15, 16, that's when I started taking it more seriously, and I wanted to go into the profession. So coming from that and then coming to Royal Holloway and being an orchestral scholar, it's different for me, because now that my head's properly in it, I approach different situations differently. So since being an orchestral scholar, I've had to take sectionals, which I've never done before, and it was really fun. And it was definitely character building. Yeah, because I wouldn't say I'm a shy person, but I like to keep to myself sometimes. So being in the position of, and leading the viola section as well, being in that position has really allowed me to gain more confidence, open up and talk to more people.
That's fantastic. I think it's wonderful that you met these conductors before you knew who they were. I think that's fantastic. And I wonder whether you, whether you feel obviously you're thankful you had those opportunities for the orchestras that you were talking about, who were just for East London or for less developed areas. Do you feel like you would have had those opportunities, or that those opportunities would have you would have been aware of those opportunities if they'd just been not directly aimed at specific communities?
I don't think so, no, because the way that I knew about those schemes was because I went to music school. So each borough in London has their own designated music service. So I was given I was like nominated for schemes from that by my music school. But if I hadn't have been in it, then I wouldn't have known at all about
Yeah,
these
because
things.
we often talk about, you know, how much should these schemes be aimed specifically at specific communities, and or should we just expect them to come, and you know, there's a real balance to be had in terms of going out and seeking people to join in these orchestras, or whether we expect them to sort of come to. So it's good you had those opportunities, and it's led you to us, which I'm personally thankful for. You also mentioned your you know, that last year being the first year that you led the violas, in terms of having a responsibility for decisions that you were making for the whole section. Can you just talk to that point for a minute?
It was a bit overwhelming sometimes, because I used to, in my old music school, I led my section for the last year I was there, but it was mainly our viola tutor. Our viola tutor would always sit with us in rehearsals, and she'd be the main person to figure out all the bowings. And from learning stuff from her as I was growing up, I had to implement that at university, which was a bit challenging, but it was nice to be able to actually have input and have the confidence to believe that the input is correct. And yeah, not like second guessing myself. So it was very nice.
And particularly when other people are relying on your decisions, you have to really be, you know, I guess it's a bit different from, you know, being principal flute. You decide how you play it, but if you decide a bowing for a whole section, it's like, if everybody hates the bowing, then it's your fault, you know.
You have to check if it matches the violins.
Yeah, well, particularly violas and second violins, you really have to be in that position of leading, but also coordinating with everybody else. So that's another really interesting position to be in. Great, thank you for your thoughts, Nima. I wanted to move on to Dan Gerner now. Yeah, there he is. And Dan's been leading the orchestra this past year, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you found that, and also the leadership sessions that you've been given, in terms of, we have a resident string quartet at Royal Holloway, the Tippett Quartet. In fact, Jeremy Isaac was supposed to join us today, and he got a gig. So he had to bow out very last minute. Sorry, that's exciting, because for those who are not aware, there's just, you know, completely no work at the moment. So he sent his immense apologies. He actually sent some video answers to my questions, but I don't think we'll have time to get those to you, but I can send them to you privately. But he did say that there's like nothing for 3 months, and then all of a sudden on the same day, 2 different organizations asked him to be in 2 places at once. But in terms of the sessions that he's given with you in leadership in particular, I wanted to know whether you could touch on that, Dan.
Yeah, so me, Ben and Rock have all been in leading positions in the Holloway Orchestra, and it's been Jeremy and also John Mills of the Tippett Quartet, I remember, has come in and did a few of these leadership sessions on you, and it was actually very interesting, because it was less playing and more attitudes towards how to convey certain things. So it was a lot of physicality in cueing an entry, for example. The communication is often completely non-verbal, because you can't turn around in the middle of a rehearsal and say, no! So you've got to do it in other ways. Certainly it's not just your section, like positioning your violin so everyone can see it behind you, but also interacting with members across the orchestra. Like it was in Rack 2 or something like that, when Laurent had a gorgeous clarinet solo, and we had to kind of be able to have a clear line of vision between the two of us to know when to interact and all that. So it's very interesting coming at it from that approach. We've also had sessions for the front desks as well, I believe, sorting things like Nima was referring to, such as the bowings, and it may seem like a mundane issue going through the bowings for an hour or so, but if you like why it all works, and potentially stylistic things as well come into play, especially, I don't know, if no one's gone into main detail on like the NMP, the side-by-side type thing, so I might divulge a bit into that if that's all right. But it was also being sat next to an active professional in the field, and you can just kind of look to your right and see, oh, he's doing it like that, which has been proven very useful, especially on stylistic things. The LNP tended to do classical stuff, obviously Mozart in the name, but we've also done Haydn and Beethoven and things like that. So the stylistic stuff before coming to UNA, hadn't played a huge amount of classical era symphonies. It tended to be the romantic repertoire, just because that was what the orchestra did. So picking up on all of that kind of stylistic things on Haydn especially has been very useful, I think.
Yeah, great. I mean, I'm glad to hear that. It's some of the hardest music to play, Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven, actually. And when I was at the Junior Royal Academy of Music, I started a classical orchestra because I found that they were the children were going from playing in like a string, their first orchestra, like a string orchestra or something, and then they would go straight into a big symphony orchestra playing Elgar, and great, fantastic Elgar, von Williams, Tchaikovsky, everything. But there's there's all this stuff in between that that where the orchestra developed and grew, and that they were going through their entire junior academy experience and not having played a Beethoven or Mozart symphony, and then they'd get to music college, or even they'd get out in the real world and they wouldn't know these pieces, they wouldn't have these tools, this experience of having played this classical repertoire. And it is the hardest stuff to do. So there is that core repertoire. Maybe it's not quite as appealing to the young musician as playing this big stuff, but it's I guess there's that saying that Mozart's too easy for kids and too difficult for adults. I'm going to touch on one other of our current scholars before I open up just the last couple of minutes for any questions. Feel free to put some questions in the chat if you want us to get to them in the next few minutes, because we'll end the session at 4:30, but we'll have a few minutes for any questions or discussion points that you'd wanted to pick up on. But I wanted a perspective, maybe from just very briefly from two of you. I really want everybody to speak, but we might not get to everybody. But particularly those who are members of other departments, and what you feel the Orchestral Scholarship program and what you feel that orchestras in general has given you in terms of your experience in other departments. Renee, in particular, I wondered if you could start and just tell us about what else you're studying, and when we talked before, you thought that it really had an impact on your view of that other department and your experiences with it, but also Laurent, who has joined us, and David as well, your experiences. If you can be sort of brief, but Renee, if you can kick it off.
Okay, hi, so I'm Renee and I study music and English. So I'm doing a 50-50 degree, so I do half music, half English. I think my membership in the orchestra especially has helped me to integrate more into the music department, because at first I found it hard to kind of negotiate between both of the departments. But especially with the orchestra and the scholarship as well, it's been a way that I can get to know everyone else who is studying music as well, and then kind of like learning how to balance my studies in the other department. So especially with the leadership opportunities that come with being an orchestral scholar, I think that's what's helped me to also kind of build up on my confidence in my violin playing, and then using those skills also in different settings, so like in seminars in both music and English, where you have to come forward and share your own ideas. That's been how I've been able to transfer what I've learned in orchestra and as an orchestral scholar into other settings.
Brilliant, that's wonderful to hear. Laurent, where have you gone? You were on my screen. Are you still with us? Laurent maybe has disappeared. Is he there? No. Maybe I'll look for Laurent while David give us a few thoughts of yours, David. Muted.
Yeah. Hi, I'm David. I do maths and music just like Ben. I've just finished up now. So yeah, just like Renee, it was a 50-50 course. I did half maths and half music. I'd say from doing the orchestra, from like having the math side of my degree involved with orchestral playing, I've been
Did we lose David?
I think we might have just lost David.
Oh dear.
Oh no.
All right, he froze and then he disappeared. Okay, maybe internet. And Laurent is not here anymore, is he? No, good. Well, maybe then just we have one question that's popped up, and then also I did want to hear from Abra in terms of Abra. Would you mind speaking just for 1 minute about your first year perspective? Like, what was it like being a first year orchestral scholar?
Yeah, so I was very apprehensive actually going into the scholarship program. I was fresh-faced, just come out of my A-levels, and I think I was the only first year this year. As well as that, I didn't do any music in my degree. I'm only doing a literature degree. So I was feeling a bit of an intruder almost right at the beginning, but that completely changed after a few weeks. And being a first year, I think you're always a bit scared to throw yourself into leadership opportunities, especially peer-to-peer leadership when you're working with people that could be like 5 years older than you. But the scholarship forced me to kind of engage in leadership, and it really, really helped my confidence and my ability as a violinist as well. I think I had to kind of fake it till I made it. And that really, really helped because I think I did make it at the end. So yeah.
Oh, that's great. I mean, I don't like to hear that you were hesitant and scared, but it's nice to hear that you've embraced fear and we're able to sort of grow into it. And I hope that experience takes you forward in whatever you do in the future. Okay, I've got a couple of questions in the chat. Let's take one from Kieran is the first one. Coming out of lockdown might be a chance to change some things about orchestral playing in general. What do you think orchestras could be doing better for their musicians and for their audiences? Well, I'm going to pick on Tom because he's reappeared on my screen. Tom, what do you think about that question?
Yeah, there we are. I think I'm back in the room. Yes, it's a good question. What could orchestras be doing better for their musicians and their audiences? I'll start selfishly with the musicians. One of the things I think that's coming out of this, and we hear it actually with the few press interviews that particularly sort of, some maybe big names in the orchestral world have given, is sort of saying that, this international touring is going to change quite dramatically. It's not uncommon, particularly for British orchestras, because we're cheap, to do what we would call a sort of a hit and run date, maybe as far afield. I'm just thinking perhaps the last one of those I did shortly before lockdown was to Romania for a day, all the way to Bucharest. I mean, that's on the border of Turkey almost. I mean, it's a very, very long way to go. The air miles in that, it's environmentally terrible to fly an entire orchestra all that way for just one concert. It's extraordinary that it's in any way financially viable, but apparently it is. But obviously, now that we're thinking about the transmission of disease and things like that, it's also going to mean that we're going to address stuff like that. And I think that will be something that will change, probably actually for the better for us, because whilst it might sound glamorous going to all these places, the reality is that now orchestral touring is very, very punishing. And so if we do more of it by train, and if we make sure that when we're doing it, we're not just doing it in this sort of one-off hit and run formula, that'll be much, much better. So I think that might be an improvement that comes out of this for musicians. In terms of audiences, well, I mean, as I said earlier, it's been great that we hear that so many people want live music. Obviously, a lot of orchestras have developed their digital platforms or are doing so at the moment. And we all sort of watched in envy at the beginning of lockdown that, the Berlin Philharmonic had already completely nailed this years ago with their digital concert hall. and I have to say, I mean, if you haven't already signed up for that, I think you can probably still get a month's free subscription as a trial, and it's a completely wonderful archive, and the production values are so high. And I hope that more arts organisations can develop things like that, because actually anything that allows us to reach more people than we can in a concert hall is a good thing. And of course, that raises questions about financing and things like that. But I mean, at the end of the day, actually, we're seeing that the arts can contribute a huge amount to the economy. And so actually the sort of the rebalancing, if we, you know, ostensibly share our art for a lower fee, I don't think is going to be a problem. I mean, we're actually pretty cheap things to run orchestras by and large, relatively speaking, when you start to look at the sort of sums of money involved, particularly in the UK. So I think those are things that might improve, fingers crossed.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear those thoughts. I'm sorry we're out of, almost out of time to talk about, because the two thoughts that I had in response to what you said in terms of touring, I mean, of course we want globalization, we want all of these, we want to share our cultures, we want to share this. Now we don't want to share our germs, and we don't want to also contribute to the climate change with all of this. So it's interesting how, the question of why we would go on tour in the first place, like why are we doing that? Is it a self-aggrandizement thing, or is it actually because you don't get much cultural engagement? It used to be that you would go on tour for the cultural engagement, but now you go there and you go back in a day, and how much are you engaging with Romanian culture? Well, hardly any, except for seeing the inside of the airport. So there's that question, isn't there? Yeah, we have one final question. Maybe you can just touch on it very briefly, Tom. As a wind player, with the current 3-meter social distancing guidelines has on winds, brass, and choral singing, are you worried about how quickly we'll be going back to full orchestral playing?
Short answer, yes, I do. More nuanced, but I take great comfort from the fact that our colleagues not too far away in mainland Europe are starting to get things going again, and that is really important to remember. And the UK government, is sort of saying, well, we're going to do our own research. I think that's absolutely fine and important, and that research is underway. And I think from what we're actually learning, that hopefully we will probably be able to have some either overall reduction in what we need between things. And so we'll just be able to do it with a meter between players, or we'll come up with a way. For example, the only bit of real playing I've done in lockdown was a few weeks ago in a studio. They set me up as a poisonous flute player in an isolation booth in the middle of the room, which was slightly strange, but it means that we were back to work and we were kind of doing the normal thing. So again, it's going to be steps, but there are signs of hope, and I am an optimist. But of course I do share that worry, particularly for wind, brass and singers. It's a little bit dicey at the moment, but hopefully the science is going to come good for us in due course, and we'll find a solution, and then hopefully we'll be back to normal before too long.
Yes, we'll be guided by the science, won't we? Well, I'm so sorry we're out of time, because there's a million things going in my brain, and things that I want to ask you and things that I want to discuss. But it's good to leave a party while we're having fun. So I wanted to just have a chance to thank all of my guests for taking the time to join us and taking the time to prepare for this. To Tom, to Sophie, to Ben, and all of our students who've joined us. I do share Tom's sentiment that it is a shame that this COVID had to interrupt your studies, but I hope that we can have some optimism that we can use this isolation for things that we wouldn't get to otherwise. And I am absolutely committed to that as my position at Royal Holloway. And Nathan, do you want to?
Hi. Oh, I think there's a bit of background noise from someone. That's okay. I just wanted to extend a heartfelt thank you to you, Rebecca, for so glamorously hosting and chairing this roundtable. Extend another heartfelt thanks on behalf of Festival Interrupted and Royal Holloway to all returning students, to all our alumni, to our current students, and of course to Tom for coming in at short notice and helping us out and really feeding this conversation beautifully. Festival Interrupted is all online, so do pop online onto our dedicated website, which is www.festivalinterrupted.org.uk, where all of our events are archived, so you can go back to them, review them, listen to them, engage with them in your own time. And once again, thank you all very much for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email. You've all got my email address by now. If not, it's on the festival website. But thank you once again, Rebecca, and thank you all. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.